I think another way to think about it, if you really want to get famous, do it some other way, right? And then use that fame to help your startup rather than like use the startup.
What are bad reasons people start startups? And so you and I have now talked to like, I don't know, thousands of founders, you think? I always ask them on some level, like, why are they doing the thing they're doing? Why they're getting the startup? And for context for people, the reason why I asked them, and Brian is shaking his head, and I think the reason why he asked them is we want to figure out whether the founder is going to be able to like tough it out through the difficult times, and that tends to come through in their motivations. And so we ask people why they start a startup, and we try to get a sense for kind of like what those reasons are, and then we kind of extrapolate why if they're going to be able to kind of stick it out. We've heard lots of bad reasons why people start startups. To me, number one bad reason is to get rich quick. Startups are a horrible way to get rich quickly for a couple of reasons. The chances of the startup kind of doing well is less than 1%. So if you just look at the expected value of starting a startup, it's just like horrible. The magnitude is really high. If it works out, yes, you'll like make lots of money and all that kind of stuff, but the percentage is like so low. And it's not quick either. I don't know if people think about startups as like, oh yeah, like somebody started an app and like a year later they were like worth $100 million or something. That's like never the case. I like can't think of a case where that's happened. If I was going to reframe this reason, what an actual startup is like, it's like get rich, probably not over a long period of time, which just sounds kind of like a bad proposition. But yeah, Brian, anything you want to add here?
Most of the success cases were built over
Yeah.
decade plus, right? Like typically what happens is like a founder will
Yeah.
start a company. If they're very lucky, they'll return
If
money
you're
to
lucky.
their
Yeah.
investors, and then they'll be like, oh, I learned it, whatever, right? And then they'll be like, oh, do I want to do another startup again? And then a second company comes and probably similar thing. Maybe they're like a slightly more successful, maybe they're not. And then like year three, and in like a 10-year journey, you've learned a ton, right? And you just like continue to keep going, and then all of a sudden you hit on something, and then that becomes like a $100 million company. And so, like, even on the success cases, what you're seeing is kind of like a build up, right, of someone's kind of like startup career over a very, very long time. And maybe the company they started was successful in 9 months because of this kind of like accumulation of experience.
I think what you're saying is that like founders take time to kind of like gestate where they're like developing and all that. So even if a company kind of like catches fire, it's that founder's probably been like working for like a long time, right? Actually,
Yeah, not always the case, but like more often than not,
I feel like
that's probably
that was
what's
the
happening.
case. I mean, we can debate kind of like how Clubhouse is doing now, but like I feel like the founder of Clubhouse, he had been basically like working on startups and thinking about growth and product for like a decade. I mean, since we started, I feel like I'd heard about that guy, and he was just like grinding away, working on stuff for a long time. And Clubhouse feels like it caught fire, but like that guy has been like he's been working on tons of different products and all of that stuff for a long time. Brian, you want to pick one from the list?
It's the like
Yeah.
to be famous, right? To like social status and uh, all that kind of stuff. It's just I don't know. I feel like I have a very strong opinion on this, which is there are certain founders that are very good at
Yeah.
marketing themselves. And it's helpful, but really
Not that
not that
helpful.
helpful for
Not,
building a
not.
company, right? And so yeah, I mean, if you're, I think another way to think about it, if you really want to get famous, do it some other way, right? And then use that fame to help your startup rather than like use the startup to.
I feel like if you're going to like tech conferences or something and you're seeing people talk on stage and you're like, oh, I want to be somebody who talks on stage, you should probably not start a startup. Like that's like most people who are starting startups and really working on a startup are not speaking at these conferences. They don't go, they don't do any of that stuff. I think this has happened. This happened, I feel like, not in the last year, but the year before that. A bad reason I think people start startups is they think it's like the cool thing to do. Like they hear like a bunch of other people doing it and it seems really cool. And I don't know, they have some friend who raised like 2 million off of nothing, like all this stuff. I think being a startup founder goes through kind of hype cycles. And I think that's just like a bad reason to kind of like do it. There's like a bandwagon kind of like jumping that happens. Again, I think now that the market is like kind of cooled off, I don't think this is like as much of a thing, but I feel like I saw it quite a lot at the like height of things. People were just like just kind of starting companies because it was like cool, which is so weird because I feel like when we started, there was like it was like a weird thing to do. But if I think if you're starting, if people are starting companies because of this hype thing, I think it's a bad call.
One more
Yeah.
kind of adjacent, which is you think the thing you're working on is
Mm,
very cool. I think this is a little bit
yeah.
subtle, so maybe I'll explain a little bit. Oftentimes people are like, AI is really cool, or like
Mm, mm,
crypto is really cool, or before it
yeah.
was kind of like hardware and like all this kind of stuff, right? 'Cause it's kind of like the latest hot trend, and I think those are like great things to follow and play around, whatever. Like I 100% think people should do it, but there's a point where you're like, should this be a startup? Should it be a company? And that's different. And so I think if you end up finding a really cool thing that you end up working on, there is one more step to be like, do I want to start a business? Is this a business? Do I want to start a startup from this? Uh, so I guess the bad reason to start a startup is like you've built something very cool.
Maybe I'll go a step further because I do think there's a lot of nuance here. Um, I think some people also start startups because of some trend, right? And so like I feel like there's a ton of people starting ChatGPT kind of like startups now. And I think they violate your law a little bit about like some problem or whatever. They're just like, ooh, ChatGPT's hot. Like, what random ChatGPT thing can we do? And they kind of start a startup around that. How do you feel about those types of kind of like startups or founders? Do you think it's okay? Do you think it's like a little weak?
Yeah, again, like I think the way I think about it is like
Mm.
great catalyst, right?
Mm.
Like great catalyst, really should have done
Mhm.
exactly what you're doing, but then you need the like you need the next step
Mm.
introspection to be like, okay, let's say now a year later this is not going to be hot. People don't care about AI. It's all of a sudden going to go to zero and it's going to be flat. Do I still really care?